The chamber was silent, too silent. Every set of eyes was locked on the woman holding a stack of papers in her hands. Karoline wasn't a stranger to confrontation, but she'd never been in a moment quite like this. Her palms were trembling, yet her voice was steady as steel. Before her sat Pete Buttigieg, polished, poised, and dismissive. Moments earlier, he had smirked and told her to do his homework if she wanted to challenge his credibility. That lineal delivered with arrogancy hung in the air like smoke after a firework. But what Pete didn't expect was that Karoline had come prepared. The exchange had begun innocently enough. Karoline, a rising voice in conservative circles, had asked Pete a pointed question about transportation failures and leadership accountability. It wasn't personal, it was policy. But instead of answering, Pete leaned back in his chair, cocked his head with that professor-like air, and quipped, "Perhaps if you did your homework, you'd understand the scope of the job." The remark drew a few chuckles from his supporters, but to Karoline, it felt like a slap, not just to her, but to every American who had grown tired of being spoken down to by elites. She could have let it slide. She could have walked away. But Karoline wasn't wired that way. With quiet determination, she reached into her folder, pulled out a stack of documents, and walked to the center of the floor. Her heels clicked against the marble like a drumbeat. And then, with the same resolve that soldiers carry into battle, she began to read. "Let's talk about homework," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Mr. Buttigieg says I haven't done mine. Well, I've done more than enough. In fact, I brought his." She lifted the papers high for everyone to see before lowering her gaze to the first page. Pete Buttigieg's copyright subtitled copyright. A hush fell across the chamber. Karoline's voice rose, calm but sharp, as she read through his early years, his Ivy League schooling, his internships, his tenure at McKinsey Company, where ordinary families often viewed consultants as the shadowy architects behind job losses. She moved on to his military service, yet acknowledging it with respect, but contrasting it with his political opportunism back home. She spoke of his time as mayor in South Bend, pointing to statistics of poverty, crime, and fractured trust among communities that felt abandoned by his leadership. With each word, the tension grew heavier. Pete's smile had faded, his polished mask slipping under the weight of cold facts. Karoline wasn't hurling insults as she was reciting receipts. Page by page, she painted the portrait of a man more concerned with titles than transformation. She noted his presidential run, how he'd charmed national media while his own city's citizens still wrestled with failing infrastructure. She reminded the chamber of the chaos at the Department of Transportation, supply chain meltdowns, flight delays, and small-town roads left to crumble while speeches were made about equity and inclusion. By the time she reached the last page, her voice no longer trembled. It soared. "This is not the copyright copyright of someone who gets to lecture the American people about homework. This is the copyright copyright of someone who has failed upward, cushioned by connections, and protected by polished words. And if he wants to tell the people of this country to do their homework, well, today we just did his." The silence broke not with laughter, but with murmurs. Even those who disagreed with Karoline found themselves leaning in, shaken by the power of her delivery. Pete shifted uncomfortably, his polished demeanor cracking as the weight of her words landed harder than any insult could. For Karoline, this wasn't just about Pete Buttigieg. It was about something bigger. It was about ordinary Americans, told time and again that they weren't smart enough, weren't informed enough, weren't qualified enough to challenge the people in power. She wanted them to see that facts are stronger than Section 8, that truth doesn't need a polished accent or a Harvard diploma to be heard. When she finished, Karoline placed the stack of papers on the desk in front of Pete. She didn't sneer, she didn't gloat, she simply looked him in the eye and said, "I hope you take time to read it yourself. Maybe then you'll understand why the American people are tired of being lectured." The room erupted not in applause, but in the kind of stillness that follows a thunderclap. It was the silence of realization, of a truth too raw to ignore. Pete said nothing. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by the uneasy stillness of a man who had just been stripped of his armor. Karoline walked back to her seat, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure how the media would spin it, or how her words would be remembered. But deep inside, she knew one thing: she hadn't just spoken for herself, she had spoken for every voice that had ever been dismissed, mocked, or silenced by those in power. And that night, when clips of the exchange went viral, the message echoed far beyond the chamber walls. It wasn't about politics, it was about courage. The courage to stand up, to prepare, to speak truth when silence would have been easier. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of doing your homework, and never underestimate the strength of someone who refuses to be silenced.